It all started with a simple move to a new house. I had just finished unpacking the last of my boxes, exhausted but excited about the fresh start. The neighborhood seemed quiet, peaceful even. Little did I know, I was about to step into a war zone, a battle against a power-hungry HOA president and her delusional sense of authority. My name is Alex Carter, and I'm a police officer. I've dealt with my fair share of difficult people, but nothing could have prepared me for the chaos that awaited me in this seemingly idyllic suburban community. The day I moved in, I noticed her almost immediately. Standing across the street, arms crossed, was a woman who looked like she had just stepped out of a corporate boardroom. Her short blonde hair was perfectly styled, her crisp blazer screamed authority, and her piercing gaze was locked on me like I had just committed a crime. Her name, as I would soon learn, was Margaret Hayes, the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood. I gave her a polite nod, hoping to start things off on the right foot, but she didn't return the gesture. Instead, she just stood there, glaring at me like I had parked a tank on her front lawn. I shook my head, grabbed my keys, and went inside, brushing off the strange encounter. The next morning, I stepped out to grab my mail and froze. Taped to my front door was a bright red violation notice. I blinked, reading it over. Unapproved vehicle parking. Remove immediately. I glanced over at my truck, parked perfectly in my own driveway, and let out a dry chuckle. This had to be a joke. Crumpling up the notice, I tossed it in the trash and went about my day. Big mistake. That afternoon, as I was unloading boxes, I heard the sharp click of heels on the pavement. I turned to see Margaret marching up my driveway, clipboard in one hand and phone in the other. "Excuse me," she snapped, her voice dripping with condescension. "I need to speak with you." I set down the box I was carrying and wiped the sweat off my forehead. "Can I help you?" She glanced at my truck, then back at me. "You need to remove that vehicle immediately." I raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, not happening." Her nose wrinkled like I had just spat on her shoes. "This community has standards. Oversized vehicles are not permitted." I leaned against my tailgate, crossing my arms. "I'm not in the HOA, Margaret." She smirked, clearly enjoying this. "Actually, your house falls within our jurisdiction. So yes, you are." I chuckled, shaking my head. "You can't just vote people into an HOA." Her eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "We already have." I exhaled, trying to keep my cool. "Look, lady, I don't care what votes you took. I never agreed to your rules." Her expression tightened. "You will comply. If you refuse, we will escalate." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? To who?" She lifted her chin, her voice dripping with faux authority. "The authorities." I stared at her for a moment, then shrugged. "Go ahead." Her eye twitched. I could tell she was expecting resistance, but not outright defiance. She turned sharply on her heel and stormed away, her heels clicking angrily against the pavement. An hour later, 3 more violation notices were taped to my fence. The next day, my mailbox was stuffed with HOA warnings. By the end of the week, I woke up to a $250 fine taped to my door for noncompliance. I laughed, tossing it in the trash. But that night, things took a darker turn. I caught someone standing outside my house, flashlight in hand, taking pictures of my truck. I checked my security camera feed and saw Margaret, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone. That's when I knew this wasn't just about petty rules. Margaret wasn't just a nosy neighbor. She was a control freak with a power complex, and she had just made a huge mistake. The next morning, I stepped outside to find yet another bright red violation notice taped to my door. This one read, "Final warning. Immediate compliance required." I actually laughed out loud. Final warning for what? Parking in my own driveway. As I crumpled it up, I heard her voice behind me. "You think this is funny?" I turned to see Margaret standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed so tightly it looked like she was holding herself together out of sheer spite. Her face was red, her eyes burning with rage. "I think it's hilarious," I said, folding my arms. Her lips pursed. "You've ignored every notice, disrespected the rules, and made a mockery of this community." I sighed. "Margaret, I'm not in your HOA." Her lips curled into a smug smile. "Not according to our records." I exhaled slowly, willing myself to stay calm. "Look, you don't have any authority here. You can't fine me, you can't force me to move my truck, and you sure as hell can't tell me what to do on my own property. So unless you have something actually useful to say, we're done here." I turned to walk back inside, but then I heard her say the words that would change everything. "I'm calling the police." I stopped in my tracks and turned back around. Margaret was already on the phone, jabbing at the screen like she was trying to break it. She smirked at me. "Let's see if you're so smug when they drag you off my property." I blinked. "Your property?" She nodded, her expression growing smugger by the second. "The HOA owns all communal spaces, including your driveway." I actually choked on a laugh. Margaret, that might be the dumbest thing I've ever heard. But she wasn't listening. She had the phone pressed to her ear now, her voice dripping with fake distress. "Yes, hello? I need an officer immediately. There's a dangerous man on my property, refusing to leave. He's being aggressive. I feel threatened." I shook my head, watching in fascination as she committed to the performance. She paced back and forth, waving her arms, even throwing in a shaky breath for effect. If I didn't know better, I'd almost believe she was actually scared. But I did know better. Because what Margaret didn't know was that while she was busy making up a fake police report, she had just called the cops on a cop. And the officer responding wasn't just going to recognize me. He was about to give Margaret a reality check she would never forget. 15 minutes later, I heard the distant sound of police sirens. Margaret stood at the edge of my driveway, arms crossed, smug as ever. She rocked on her heels, watching the street like a kid waiting for the ice cream truck. She had no idea that the officer arriving wasn't just any cop. It was someone who knew me personally. A black and white cruiser pulled up, and the second the door swung open, I recognized the guy stepping out. Officer Ryan Carter, one of my old academy buddies. Ryan took one look at me, then at Margaret, then back at me, his face filled with amusement and confusion. Margaret, on the other hand, lit up like it was Christmas morning. She hurried over to him, practically bouncing on her toes. "Officer, thank God you're here. This man is trespassing on HOA property. He's refused multiple removal notices, and when I asked him to leave, he got aggressive." I feared for my safety. Ryan's eyes flicked to me, and I saw the tiniest twitch of a smirk. He already knew something wasn't adding up. I folded my arms. "Ryan, you want to tell her, or should I?" Margaret blinked, her confidence faltering for the first time. "Tell me what?" Ryan sighed and turned to face her. "Ma'am, he's not trespassing." Margaret let out a high-pitched scoff. "What? Of course he is. This is HOA property, and he—" Ryan shook his head. "No, ma'am. This is his property." Margaret's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. But the HOA owns." Ryan pulled out his notepad. "Ma'am, do you have any legal documents proving that?" Margaret's face turned red. I don't need documents. I'm the HOA president." Ryan nodded slowly. "Uh-huh. Well, here's the thing. HOA rules only apply to residents who have legally signed agreements. And if he hasn't signed anything," he turned to me. "You haven't, right?" I shook my head. "Nope." Ryan smirked. "Then he's not under your jurisdiction." Margaret's face went completely pale. For the first time, it was starting to sink in. She messed up. I smiled. "Oh, and Margaret, there's one more thing you should probably know." Her eyes snapped to mine. "What?" I reached into my back pocket, pulled out my badge, and flipped it open. "I'm a police officer." Margaret's mouth actually dropped open. I had never seen someone's entire world shatter so fast. Her gaze darted from my badge to Ryan, then back to me. No, that's fake," she blurted out, taking a step back. "You're lying. There's no way you—" Ryan chuckled. "Nope. He's legit. We went through the academy together." Margaret made a strangled noise in the back of her throat. Her smug confidence was gone. Her control over the situation was gone. And just like that, she went into full panic mode. Margaret's head snapped toward Ryan. I want to file a complaint against him. He threatened me. He's abusing his power. This is misconduct." Ryan sighed. "Ma'am, you called 911 and falsely reported a crime. That's actually an arrestable offense." Margaret froze. I could practically hear the gears in her head grinding. She had dug a hole for herself, and now she was trying to claw her way out. She took a deep breath, forcing a fake smile. "Oh, officer, let's just forget this happened, okay? No need for—" Ryan cut her off. "Too late for that, ma'am." Margaret's entire body stiffened. And that's when she made her next mistake. She doubled down. "No, this is harassment. I want to speak to your supervisor." Ryan raised an eyebrow. You sure about that? Margaret didn't hesitate. Yes. Ryan exhaled, pulled out his radio, and clicked the button. Dispatch, requesting a supervisor at my location for an HOA dispute. I crossed my arms, watching the meltdown unfold. Margaret had just demanded an audience with the very people who were about to rip her world apart. And when the supervisor arrived, her day was about to go from bad to catastrophic. 15 minutes later, a second police cruiser pulled up, and out stepped Sergeant Daniels. Daniels was the kind of officer who had seen it all, a big guy in his 50s with sharp eyes and absolutely zero patience for nonsense. He took one look at the scene, Margaret practically vibrating with outrage, Ryan looking amused, and me standing there with my arms crossed, and let out a sigh. All right, what's going on here? Margaret sprinted over like she had just been saved. Oh, thank goodness you're here. This man, he's been harassing me. He's a danger to the community, and he's impersonating a police officer. Daniels raised an eyebrow, his gaze flicking to me, then to Ryan. Impersonating a police officer? Ryan smirked. Nope, he's actually one of us. Daniels turned back to Margaret, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to absolute disbelief. Wait, you called 911 on a cop? Margaret's face twitched. I didn't know. But that doesn't change the fact that he's violating HOA regulations, and we have every right to remove him. Daniels rubbed his temples. Ma'am, we're not here to enforce HOA rules. We're here for criminal matters. Margaret let out a frustrated screech. But he won't move his truck. He won't comply. He's a menace to this neighborhood. Daniels exhaled slowly. He was already done with her. Let me get this straight. You called 911 because you don't like where he parks? Margaret stiffened. I called because I felt threatened. Daniels stared at her for a long moment, then turned to me. Did you threaten her? I shook my head. Nope. I told her I wasn't in the HOA and walked away. Ryan added. I've been here for 5 minutes, and the only aggressive one has been her. Margaret's face turned beet red. You're all against me. This is a conspiracy. The HOA has rights, and we. Daniels held up a hand. All right, enough. I'm pulling the call logs. Margaret froze. What? Daniels pulled out his radio. Dispatch, I need the 911 recording from this location. I almost laughed at how fast Margaret started backpedaling. Wait, no? There's no need for that. Daniels ignored her, listening to his earpiece as the call played. I couldn't hear it, but I knew exactly what it sounded like. Margaret fake crying, pretending I was some kind of dangerous criminal. After a few moments, Daniels closed his eyes and exhaled. Ma'am, do you realize filing a false police report is a crime? Margaret's mouth opened and closed, her panic turning into desperation. No, it wasn't false. He's a threat to the neighborhood. Daniels waved over Ryan. Get her ID. She's coming with us. Margaret's entire body locked up. Wait, what? No. I'm the victim here. Daniels didn't even look up. You called 911 under false pretenses. That's a misuse of emergency services, and depending on how the DA feels, you could be looking at criminal charges. Margaret stumbled back, shaking her head. She wasn't just losing control, she was spiraling. No, you don't understand. I was trying to protect the community. This man, he's been ignoring HOA rules. He's defying the board, and Anne. Daniels held up a hand. Ma'am, let me ask you something. Margaret froze. Daniels looked her dead in the eye. You keep saying the HOA this, the HOA that, but do you even have legal authority to enforce anything? Margaret blinked. What? Of course we do. Daniels crossed his arms. You got proof of that. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. And that's when I saw it, the first real sign of fear in her eyes. Daniels picked up on it too. Ryan, check county records. Let's see if this HOA has any actual legal authority. Margaret snapped her head toward him. You can't do that. Ryan smirked. Oh, but I can. He pulled out his phone, accessed public records, and started scrolling. It took him less than a minute. Then he grinned. Well. Would you look at that? Daniels raised an eyebrow. What? Ryan turned the phone around. This HOA? It was never legally registered with the county. Dead silence. Margaret's face drained of color. Daniels sighed. So let me get this straight. You've been fining people, sending violation notices, and calling the cops on folks over rules that don't even legally exist. Margaret looked like she was about to faint. I couldn't help myself. Huh. So all those fines you've been handing out? Worthless. Ryan nodded. And that power you think you have? Also worthless. Margaret made a choking noise. That's a lie. The HOA. Daniels held up a hand. Enough. We're going to have a little talk downtown. Margaret whimpered. You can't arrest me. Margaret looked physically ill. Her entire empire, the rules, the fines, the control, was a fraud, and now it was all coming down. But Margaret wasn't the only one who was about to feel the heat. If she had been running a fake HOA, then the board members were in on it too. Margaret stood there, her hands shaking, her face pale as the reality of the situation finally sank in. The HOA, the thing she had lorded over this community with, was a sham. She had no real power, no authority, no legal standing. And she knew it. But instead of accepting defeat, she did what every narcissist does when they realize they've lost. She doubled down. This is harassment, she shrieked, pointing at Daniels and Ryan like she was some kind of victim. You're abusing your authority. I will have your jobs for this. Daniels let out the longest, most exhausted sigh I'd ever heard. Ma'am, we literally just pulled the county records. You've been illegally extorting people, issuing fake fines, and now you've misused emergency services. You're lucky I haven't cuffed you yet. Margaret clenched her fists, her whole body trembling, but not in fear. In pure, unhinged rage. You're lying, she shouted. This HOA is legitimate. It's been running for years. You think you can just take that away? You think you can ruin everything I built? I laughed. You didn't build anything, Margaret. You scammed people. And now you're paying for it. Her head snapped toward me so fast I thought she might give herself whiplash. You, she screamed. This is your fault. I smirked. Yeah, I guess it is. Margaret lost it. She lunged forward, finger jabbing the air wildly, screaming every insult she could muster. You think you're so smart. You think you're better than me. You're nothing. You're a nobody. This is my community. I made it what it is. People respect me. They listen to me. Ryan let out a low whistle. Lady, you're 2 seconds away from getting yourself arrested for disorderly conduct. Daniels nodded. Yeah, I'd recommend shutting up right about now. Margaret wasn't listening. She turned back to me, her face contorted in pure hatred. You think you won? She spat. I will sue you. I will take everything you own. I will make your life miserable. I sighed, pulling out my phone. Hey, Ryan. Ryan raised an eyebrow. Yeah. How many people do you think she scammed in this neighborhood? Ryan smirked. Hard to say, but judging by how many times she's mentioned the community, I'd guess a lot. I nodded. Cool. Let's fix that. I opened my camera app, hit record, and pointed it right at Margaret. She froze, her entire demeanor changing the second she saw the red recording light. She staggered back like I had just pulled a gun on her. No, you can't film me. I grinned. I can't actually. Public property and all that. Daniels crossed his arms. And since this is an ongoing investigation, I have no reason to stop him. Margaret looked like she was going to pass out. I turned the camera back on her. So, Margaret, want to explain to the good people of this neighborhood why you've been stealing their money for years? She screeched, full-on banshee shriek. Stop recording. I'll sue you for defamation. This is slander. This is... I tilted my head. No, it's just the truth. Daniel sighed. All right, I've had enough of this. He pulled out his cuffs. Margaret's rage turned to sheer panic. No, you can't arrest me. I'm the HOA president. Daniel smirked. Not anymore, you're not. Margaret tried to run. It was the slowest, most pathetic escape attempt I had ever seen. She got about 5 steps before Ryan grabbed her arm and gently pulled her back. She collapsed onto the ground in full meltdown mode. I'm being assaulted. I'm being attacked. Help. Someone help me. Ryan looked at Daniels. I swear, every HOA Karen pulls the same moves. Daniels nodded. Yep. Margaret kicked and flailed, but it was pointless. Within seconds, Daniels had her wrists locked in cuffs. Margaret Hayes, you are under arrest for filing a false police report, harassment, and fraudulent financial activity related to the HOA. Margaret screamed. No, this isn't happening. I'll sue you. I'll have your badges. Daniels clicked his radio. Dispatch, We have one in custody. Requesting transport. Ryan and I watched as Margaret finally realized she was out of options. She stopped screaming, stopped fighting. She just sat there on the pavement, completely defeated. For the first time since this whole thing started, she had nothing left to say. But Margaret wasn't the only problem. Because now it was time for the entire HOA board to face the music. And when the homeowners found out, let's just say they weren't going to be as forgiving as I was. Margaret sat there on the pavement, wrists cuffed, breathing hard like she had just run a marathon. The smugness, the arrogance, the phony authority she had wielded over this neighborhood for years, gone. All that was left was a woman who had finally lost control. But we weren't done. Because Margaret might have been the loudest, but she wasn't the only one responsible for this scam. The entire HOA board had backed her up, and now they were next. Daniels leaned against his cruiser, watching Margaret like she was a pile of paperwork he didn't want to deal with. Then he turned to Ryan. How many homeowners do you think she scammed? Ryan crossed his arms. Gotta be in the dozens, at least. Maybe more. Daniels nodded. Then let's see how they feel about this. He turned to me. You mind spreading the word? I grinned. Oh, I'd be happy to. I pulled out my phone, opened the neighborhood Facebook group, and started typing. Public notice. HOA President Margaret Hayes has been arrested for fraud, harassment, and misuse of emergency services. Any fines, fees, or penalties issued by her or the HOA may be fraudulent. Please contact local authorities for assistance. And then, for good measure, I uploaded the video of Margaret's meltdown. It took exactly 4 minutes before the first comment came in. Then another. Then 10 more. People started calling, texting, knocking on doors. Within minutes, a crowd was forming at the end of my driveway. Homeowners, residents, people who had been dealing with Margaret's nonsense for years. And the second they saw her in cuffs, they cheered. One guy, middle-aged, glasses, looked like he'd been stressed out for a decade, stepped forward. Does this mean the HOA is done? Daniel shrugged. That depends. Who else is on the board? A woman in the crowd raised her hand. I am. But I was voted in last year, and Margaret made every decision herself. She barely even let us read the finances. Ryan nodded. That's interesting, because we're about to do a full audit on those finances. And if we find anything linking the board to fraudulent activity. The woman paled. I never touched the money. She controlled all of that. Ryan smirked. Then you better cooperate, huh? The board members looked like they wanted to disappear. Margaret, still on the ground, jerked her head toward them. Don't you dare turn on me. We're in this together. The tallest board member, Doug, slowly shook his head. Margaret, you told us the HOA had legal authority. Margaret's eyes went wild. It does. We just need to. Doug stepped back. I'm out. The other board members followed suit. Margaret lost it. You cowards. You're nothing without me. I built this community. I chuckled. Yeah, and now you're going to watch it fall apart. Margaret tried one last time to reclaim her power. She turned to Daniels, her voice shaking. You can't do this. You can't just destroy everything I worked for. Daniels let out a long breath. Ma'am, you destroyed it yourself. She slumped. That was it. The fight was over. Daniels clicked his radio. Transport's here. Let's wrap this up. A second cruiser pulled in, and 2 officers stepped out. Margaret physically shrank as they hauled her up and walked her toward the car. She tried one last time to save face, lifting her chin and addressing the crowd. You'll regret this. All of you. This neighborhood will fall apart without me. Nobody said a word. The officers shut the door, the cruiser rolled away, and just like that, Margaret was gone. The homeowners stared in stunned silence for a moment. Then, slowly, people started talking, laughing, cheering. The HOA was finished. Every fake fine gone. Every fraudulent rule overturned. And the board completely disbanded. Ryan patted my shoulder. I gotta say, man, that was satisfying to watch. I grinned. It really was. Daniels shook his head, already walking back to his cruiser. I need a coffee. And as for me, I grabbed my coffee off my porch, leaned against my truck, and watched as the neighborhood finally got its freedom back. Margaret wanted me gone. Instead, she lost everything. And after today, there wouldn't be an HOA left to enforce a damn thing. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood came together in a way I had never seen before. Without the oppressive shadow of the HOA looming over them, people started to actually enjoy living there. Block parties became a regular occurrence, and neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak to each other were now sharing stories, laughter, and even the occasional barbecue. As for me, I kept my truck parked right where it was, in my driveway. And every time I walked past Margaret's old house, now empty and up for sale, I couldn't help but smile. Justice had been served, and the neighborhood was finally free. But the best part? I never received another violation notice again. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.